Friday the 13th, a day where superstition tells us if it can go wrong, it probably will. It's almost like an official day for Murphy's Law. And to any triskaidekaphobics out there, I hope your day's been passable at least. That is the fear of the number 13. It's almost like a day where the universe, fate, whatever you want to call it, is conspiring against you. The bad luck will follow. But this isn't about the day, this isn't about the film series with the same title. This is Lake Mungo, a mockumentary about a family dealing with the loss of the daughter Alice. And many people tell you it's a ghost story. And I think they're wrong. It's a mystery, it's a mockumentary, but it's not a ghost story, it's something else. Yes, there is one particular sort of paranormal event, I suppose you could say, that's very hard to explain any other way, but for the most part, they're actually explained in film. And I love that, because it gets us into Russell and June's mindset. In grief, you can convince yourself of so many things, you often perhaps feel kind of on your toes, you know, you're not sure what to believe. And it really sells that by these misdirects on whether, in fact, Alice is coming back, whether she is a ghost, whether she really did die. All of these questions, and I do think it handles it beautifully. And I think they fall into the trap that is quite common, and we sort of hear it quite early on in the film, where, you know, they say that they are still holding on to blame because it's better than not. You know, it's this weird idea we have when we grieve that even holding on to something negative, even like, you know, something like blame for what happened, because they were there on the day, so they feel that they could have stopped it. So even like holding on to that is better than letting the deceased go. And it's, like I say, a common trap, because we don't want to forget them. To forget them would be awful. But as they do throughout the film, and as we do in life, I hope, we come out the other side and go, I don't have to forget them, just stop obsessing over it. You know, that's the healthy way out. But it is a process that needs to be followed. It's quite common to hear people sort of saying how the world is just carrying on, but there's this, well, in this case, Alice-shaped hole there. Everyone's still going to work, school, having coffee with friends, doing their hobbies, whatever it may be. But there's a gap. Why doesn't anyone care? It's a very common thing. I know it's a different topic, but Skeeter Davis, you know, the end of the world, it's that idea, you know, it's don't they know it's the end of the world? Why is everyone carrying on like everything's normal? And like I say, it's very common and understandable, because your world has been broken, your world has been shattered, it's ended as you know it, and you now have to adapt to a world where that person is no longer there. It's not easy. And people deal with this in very different ways. We do see that Russell throws himself into his work, and that is a cause of concern for a colleague, you know, because yes, trying to carry on as normal is a valiant effort at least, but there's a line, and a lot of people will know that line. I mean, you know, people grieve in different ways, and that can't be taken away. You know, however Russell deals with it is however he deals with it, and I do think it handles that well. It's saying that perhaps it was unhealthy, but, you know, appreciates the fact that people do it at their own time, at their own speed, in their own way. But there is the interesting element of closure that does raise its head, because of the three of them, of Russell, June and Matty, Russell's the only one who saw the body. Now, we do see pictures throughout the production, and I would believe that at least June has seen the pictures for further sort of closure for her, but that's conjecture on my part. But Russell's the only one who actually went and identified it. He wanted to protect June, and I think Matty would have been a bit young, you know, even if he's in his teens. I mean, ideally no one should see a body really at any point if it can be avoided, but, you know, I understand Russell's motivation. He was being quite valiant really and trying to protect his family, but it meant that he had an element of closure, even though he does say in the opening part of the film, you know, he leaves a light on still to help her come back. And later on, you know, he says he still questions it even though he saw the body. But June never got that closure, and I think that's a really important part of this film. June never saw the body, and, you know, Russell admits that perhaps it wasn't the best idea. She admits that maybe it would have been different if she had seen it. But it does, you know, show that closure is a very important part of the grieving process, however it's gained. You know, if it is the unfortunate way of having seen and identified the body, or if it's, you know, through events that happen, and I'm glad to say that the film does, I think, give the family closure. But one of the things that is mentioned is a sort of vision of Alice, and it could be a ghost, it could be just grief hallucination. It can happen. Your mind is affected. You're probably not sleeping well. You're exhausted. You're having to make all these arrangements. It's tiring on you. So I can believe hallucinations could happen. And that's where the film really picks up the speed of being a sort of ghost story. Like I say, I still stand by the fact that that is a wrong definition for the most part for this film. And it's interesting that this spurs an interest in Matty in photography. Now, yes, we find out that he did have an interest in photography before. He was taking photos of the backyard. But it's really sort of after this that, he sort of really throws his efforts into it. He gets advice on techniques, etc. from a photographer. And it's interesting that the January photo of the backyard doesn't have anything. Now, Alice died in December, so it's feasible her ghost could have showed up. But it's only the April one, after he's got the help and advice, and obviously, this situation of maybe there's a ghost there. And the question in June's mind of, did she really die? So it's only after that. This is the start of the deception by Matty, and he says later in the film, it wasn't malicious. He just wanted to help get evidence on getting the exhumation, and sort of help his mum deal. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as they say. But this leading to the exhumation wasn't necessarily the best idea, of course, as we find out. In many ways, they lost her the first time when they left the dam and they didn't have her with them. They couldn't find her. They just had to go home and say she's missing. And then they lost her again, when the DNA confirmed, yes, Russell didn't get it wrong. That was Alice. She is dead. And I really feel for them in that moment, when they find out that, yeah, that was your daughter. Because, like I say, it's twice. It's bad enough losing her the first time, but twice is really hard, I can imagine. But of course, June's quest for closure, for answers, doesn't end there, and she enlists Ray into the mix to get some help, and has the contact with him. And it's very interesting how well they play that. They are very sympathetic to psychics, I think, in this film, and rightly so in some ways. It's a topic for another day, perhaps, that I might have to elaborate on further. But if it is genuinely helping people and you're not charging through the nose, I think there is a place for it. If people need it, to grieve or to deal or to get answers, even if those answers are coming from within, in the end of it, then yes, people like Ray do have a place. And like I say, I think they handled that quite well. Now, the situation with Ray obviously brings to light Matty's duplicity, I guess you could say. When they sort of have the camera set up, etc., and everything's sort of been staged, and it's where the reveal comes through. But another important, I think, reveal happens obviously with Ray as well, which is the fact that June isn't the first member of the Palmer family to go and see him. When they find the diary and see that yes, Alice had been to see him because of these horrific dreams she'd had, these visions of her own death as far as she was aware. And you can understand them in some ways, perhaps directing some of the blame at Ray. You can understand them feeling quite a touch of animosity towards him, I guess you could say, because he's withheld that information. He's chosen not to come forward. And I fully understand where they're coming from, but conversely, I think they're a little hard on him. I do. Because he says it himself, and I think they sort of understand it as well. The confidentiality between them is understandable, is acceptable, and I think is expected. Yes, it's not like a doctor, he isn't under any sort of oath to do that, and she is 16, as we're told repeatedly throughout the film, so, it's perfectly acceptable for her to have this kind of secret. But I do think they are a bit harsh, and I'm glad that at the end, they do resolve it, and they do sort of speak to Ray again, and they do sort of repair that, because I think he was only trying to act in their interests, and perhaps didn't want to say, well, actually, I've met Alice, she was very upset before her death, she was very worried about her death, because, as we see, June and her own mother find it difficult to discuss, find it difficult to be open about issues they've had, and it's something that seems to be passed down through that maternal line. So I think it would have just made June feel even more guilty at that point, and I think it's something that she needed to come to in time, when she was a bit more mentally capable, I guess, of dealing with it, after handling most of the grief. That was an interesting thing when obviously the TUI video is found, because again, we're like, well, actually, this bit wasn't faked by Matty, and the TUI situation comes up. Now, the age of consent, this is based in Victoria, in Australia, and the age of consent is 16, and there isn't a specific adultery law. Although, of course, if this happened before her 16th birthday, I can understand it on those grounds, but one of the defences they use is she consented. So I don't know if that's, something that I just don't understand. I'm not Australian, so, But I did look up adultery laws, and whilst it's not outlawed, the law kind of specifically says anything between consenting adults, 18 plus, is their own business. Now, obviously, if the age of consent, like over here, is lower than what you'd be considered legally an adult, there are issues at play there. I think there are grey areas. And maybe that's why, there was this issue with it. But the fact, that the police said, well, there isn't probably much we can do, I think backs up the fact that, yes, she was 16 at the time, she was consenting, even if she wasn't an adult in the proper legal sense. But it's still underhanded, it's still a secret. And again, it just cements this idea of June's guilt at not being able to be spoken to. And I find it very interesting, the story that she tells, Alice sort of saying, she was at the foot of the bed, really upset, and she just felt like she couldn't tell her anything. That line had been crossed, now she couldn't open up to her. And of course it references, June's dream about her walking to the foot of the bed, or when she, couldn't open her eyes, she didn't want to wake up, but also her consultation where she said she saw Alice and she looked sad. It's cleverly encapsulated in this, it does reference back the fact that, Alice's consultation referenced these two things that June experienced after her death. It's where we start to see a bit of a ramp up towards a more paranormal element. Because, of course, we do find the footage from Alice's phone, when we find that that's been buried, down at Lake Mungo. And the fact that she sees the figure. And like I said earlier, about the day, fate in the universe can conspire against us, and arguably, maybe Alice is a victim of this. She saw a very close approximation of what her body would look like from the dam at Lake Mungo, months before it happened. That's creepy. It's everything else in the film, like I say, pretty much is easy to explain. And I find it very poetic, whilst we're sort of brought into this final, as I say, more paranormal element of the film finally, that we have the bookend, if you will, with Alice quotes. At the start of the film, she mentions how terrified she was. She could feel that something was coming together. Well, is that something bad had already happened, and she was catching up.
I feel like something bad is going to happen to me. Or I feel like something bad has happened. It hasn't reached me yet, but it's on its way.
This idea that time perhaps is not linear. Events have already happened, and we're just waiting till we're actually in line with them. And it's very deep, really, for a 16-year-old, I think, to think of. But again, like I say, very poetic that it bookends her fright at this, because, like I say, it's only really at the end that we get a full ramp up towards paranormal situations. This idea that she was fated, this idea that she foresaw it and that she knew it was coming for her, is very, very hard for anyone to deal with, let alone a 16-year-old. I think an adult suddenly having to deal with this realization would be awful. And as I say, it brings in the question of fate. Does it exist? Maybe. Maybe it does. For her, it definitely seems like it's a very high possibility. And this is, I think, a classic ghost story ending. Because after all this revelation, once the phone's found, everything goes quiet again. Everything seems fine. The family move, they are able to deal with it. They move on physically and spiritually and emotionally and psychologically, I guess. It's a classic ghost story ending. The truth is out, everyone can rest. But Like I say, it's not a ghost story really. It's got elements, but this is a tale of grief. We are shown, from the start, a family finding it hard to deal with the loss of their sister or daughter, as the case may be. They do everything they can to get answers, to even say maybe it wasn't her, maybe she's just gone missing. They do everything within their power to avoid it. Normal grief. They get answers they don't like and they get annoyed, they lash out, they push people away who are trying to help them. Classic grief. They finally get the answers they seek. They move on with their lives. They remember Alice fondly. They remember the good. They remember the not so good, but mostly the good. Classic grief. Classic coming out the other side of grief. And that's what I think this film is about. That's what I've been, I think, drawn to with this film. It's what has stayed with me. The resonance that's kind of impacted on me. And once you think of it as a film about grief, it does become very different. I definitely took a different view of it this time around. But just one final thing, just to bring back the weird, spooky element. It is October after all. The end bit. Now, I'm quick to say it could be just clever editing, but it could be them communicating across time, where we see elements of Alice's consultations and June's final consultation with Ray, where they can, well, Alice can see her mum, but she can't see Alice. Like I say, could be just editing, or it could be something spooky. So until next time, as always, take care.